Hey there YouTube, welcome on back to Artichoke Dip. This video is a little bit different than what I normally do. Normally I'd be popping up on screen and saying, hey there YouTube, welcome on back to Artichoke Dip, but not this time. Especially for the content that I'm getting ready to introduce to you. I just feel as if it wouldn't be fitting. Typically most of my games would include dungeon crawling and a world full of vast amounts of dark magics and warriors and, of course, weapons of renown. But I kind of needed a break from that. I was kind of getting bored, if you will, with the dungeon crawling experience. Needed a break for a while, and I needed something different. And that's where this video is going to take us. But first, I got to introduce some concepts to you. Get you to understand a few things, so that way the game will make a lot more sense to you. So without further ado, let's initiate Project Aurora. So, up to this point in gaming, we've used a hex graph, which is superior to a regular graph, a four-sided square. Whereas if with a six-sided hex, you have six different possibilities of movement that you can move a miniature across the board. The game that I'm going to be talking about is no different. It still utilizes a hex graph, but for lateral movement. When we get into your miniature being able to achieve 360-degree movement, that is something a little different unto itself. And at that point, we have to think of a hex graph as more than just 6 sides, but now we have to reimagine it as 12 sides. So now let's imagine this 3D 12-sided sphere, if you will. So if 3 of the 80 sides are occupied at any given time, that leaves 9 other options available to you to be able to move in any way you want. 360 degrees, moving laterally 360 degrees across the board. There's just one thing left in this equation for the gaming, and that is energy. How to keep this miniature that can travel in any possibility of a 360-degree movement, 360 degrees laterally across the hex graph. And for that, we're going to need some power. Welcome to Flight Leader. This is an old game. It's an old gem that I picked up fairly cheaply too. If you look at going prices today for gaming stuff, coming in at 27 bucks for a complete game. And I'll tell you what, it has really helped me through a gaming slump that I went through. Yeah, I kind of got with everything going on, I didn't really have time to engage into RPG. But with Flight Leader, once you learn the basics, you can set something up fairly quickly. But depending on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, and I'm referring to the rule booklet, of course, because there is the basic game. And then you have the full game, which is where you elaborate a little bit more on your basic movements. And then moving on from there, you go into the advanced rules. And then an entire section to optional rules, which just give you more freedom and options with physical limitations, of course, because you're going to have to do a lot more in-depth analysis of what you want to do and see if the physics will allow it. then flight leader is going to be maybe your game, my friend. Let's take a deeper look. So in flight leader, there are two, I'm going to say, main pieces of information that is critical to know about the craft you are flying in the game. And the good thing is this covers the entire catalog of all the aircraft that are used. So let's start with the basics, and those are your max speed and your max altitude. And let's start with speed first. So when it comes to speed, we have to understand that there are three different modes of speed settings that we can apply to our turbofan jet engines. The first speed setting is at an idle, which is next to no fuel consumption. As a matter of fact, measured in 0 points of fuel loss. More about fuel and fuel loss here in a moment. Your second speed rating is military. At military, you're entering subsonic speeds, and in game terms, that means that your miniature can travel 6 hexes across the game map laterally. Now, the next and final speed setting of your turbojet fan engine is your afterburner. Your afterburner is going to consume 2 points of fuel, but when you do hit subsonic speeds, you're going to be moving now 10 hexes per game turn instead of 9, and depending on maneuvers and your decision, you're only going to increase speed from there on out. Now, next thing is to think about is altitude, which is a little bit more in depth. So altitude in flight leader is counted in 6 steps. One step is equivalent to 3,280 feet, but it's not something you really have to worry about at this point, and later videos when I get it to the board I'll show you how I use altitude step counters to keep track of all this. But let's just take the altitude steps for what it is at this tutorial so you can understand the basics of the game. So altitude, as I said, is measured in 6 steps: 1 through 2, 3 through 4, and 5 through 6. They are grouped in those 3 categories. In the easy way that I remember them, a step climb of 1 to 2, whether you are climbing in altitude or diving in altitude, descending I should say, is going to be, think about it as a 15-degree angle up to a 30-degree angle. Now, if you wanted to do an altitude change of 3 to 4, whether you're climbing altitude or diving altitude, at that point, think of that degree angle anywhere from 30 to 60 degrees. And the last but not least will be the altitude change of 5 or 6, which you got it, whether you're climbing and gaining 6 altitude steps or diving and at that point reducing 6 altitude steps. That would represent anywhere from 60 to 90 degrees of movement. Okay. Now that you have that down, let's take a closer look at how altitude and speed work together and make more sense of all of this. Okay, moving on from here. Now let's take a closer look at how speed and altitude are both very important to the entire game structure and how things are going to play out. Okay, so let's use an example of an F-18 Hornet. Let's say our F-18 Hornet is currently cruising at an altitude of 12 steps, and our speed is set at military, which will bring us in at a speed of 9, which is subsonic speed. So if we subtract 9 from 12, we're quickly going to come to 3. 3 is the number of hexes that is available to us to be able to move our miniature on the tabletop. And you will quickly notice the higher up in altitude you go, whether you're climbing or particularly when you're climbing, you're going to lose speed and you're going to have to compensate. But as you descend levels and you come down, you're going to begin to increase speed because now gravity is helping pull you back down towards Earth, and you can actually conserve fuel that way by going to a lower setting on your engine for your next game turn or game turns, just depending on how you planned your flight path. So as you can see, you have to take a lot of consideration in for speed, not only to keep your craft up in the air, but you also have to keep in mind on how many fuel points you have, because as I said before, those engines are hungry and they're going to drink the fuel down. Now, all of this, and you have to be mindful of the terrain you're flying through, adjusting your altitude for that, and then using gravity to your benefit to be able to descend through altitude to pick up speed and maintain headings. You still with me? I hope so, because we're getting to the point of maneuvering. Okay, so this is where we get into maneuvering. And maneuvering is just going to add another level of complexity, but at the very base of it, you'll see it's actually pretty simple. Once I get you to understand a couple concepts. You remember that 12-sided die I talked about representing 12 sides of a hex? And then of course our two-dimensional board being represented as a flat hex, if you will. So let's take a quick look at this real quick. So by now it should be apparent that what I'm referring to is the 12-sided die, or the 12-sided hex, if you will, is a representation of your miniature aircraft. And then of course your hex grid is what's on the table, and that's going to pinpoint where you are at currently on the terrain, and also tracks your movement as well for your speed. So now let's talk about maneuvering and how all of this is going to come together as one and make a lot more sense. So if you recall, if we look at the 12-sided die, if it's easier for you to remember it that way, or the hexagon that I have, remember I said you have 3 areas that will always be occupied. And an easy way to think about this is one hex side will represent the nose of the aircraft. Now 90 degrees from that will be a wing of your aircraft touching another hex area of this hexagon you're in. And then of course you're going to have your tail section that's going to touch 180 degrees, obviously, from the nose on the other end. This is going to leave you 9 available options for maneuvering, which is exactly how many maneuver options you have in Flight Leader. And they break them up into very simple to understand diagram, and let's take a look at that and break that up a little bit more. Now, in Flight Leader, we record the maneuver matrix in 9 different options. But just like climbing altitude, they are all grouped together in 3 different categories, and that's the easiest way to look at them. So let's take a look at them right now. The very top one on the maneuver matrix is the dive section. So at this point, you're going to be descending altitude, going towards Earth. You can choose three different maneuvers you can do. You could dive to the left, so now you're going to be heading off to the left on the game board. You can dive straight ahead, or you can dive to the right. The center column we see is the level, and level flight is in fact just that. If you are just cruising at, we'll say, an idle speed at 12 altitude steps and you are level, you're going to be able to pretty easily navigate the board at that altitude. But what if you have to change heading, but you don't want to either lose speed or altitude? You can then at that point level left, which is going to be bank left from your position and or bank right, or maintain your heading as level flight. Now let's look at the very bottom column and the last one, which is three more options to choose from. And this will be going vertical, which means you're going to be gaining altitude. And you can climb straight vertical, you can climb vertically to the left, and vertically to the right. Now the thing about maneuver, when we take this in conjunction and we factor in both our speed and our altitude restrictions depending on our speed climb chart, we will quickly come to the equation is if it's achievable or if it's physically unachievable. Okay, so now we're at the last step of understanding the basics of flight leader and operating your craft. And the very last thing we have to understand after we have calculated speed, altitude climb or descend, maneuver, the direction we're heading into, and if the physics are going to allow us to be able to make an altitude change at that current speed, we have to factor in turns. And this is a simple table that it uses for the game, and you can think of it this way. When you go into a very high G turn, that affects your aircraft, it affects your airframe, it affects the pilot, it affects everything. And depending on how fast you're going, well, the faster things can occur and the more you can deal with that. Think of it this way. If you are flying at a subsonic speed and you're at a high altitude, you're going to be able to perform various maneuvers before you're going to probably have to correct your altitude again and readjust your speed settings. Versus if you're running at a slower speed, closer to an idle, your maneuvers are going to be far more restricted as to what you can do because, simply put, you just don't have the speed to compensate them. Let's take a look at turning, and I'm going to touch on the basics of turning and how they apply to the game in the basic rule. Now when it comes to Flight Leader's turn modes, or turn mode chart I should say, it's a very simple concept to grasp. Basically, it's a cross chart. You look at your speed and you cross that to your turn mode, which it will give you a turn type depending on your scenario. More about that. That has more to do with advanced rules and not really into the scope of what we're talking about here. To put it in a more basic term, when it comes to turns, there's three things we have to remember. If we want to make a normal turn, that's going to reduce our speed by 1 point. If you want to make a very tight turn, that's going to reduce your speed by 2 points. Now, if you would like to make a wide turn, which at that point you have to make a turn and an arc covering 3 hexes on the map. It will cost you 0 cost in fuel expense. And when you factor all of this in with your speed, altitude, your physics and altitude climb, maneuvering, and now turns, and you realize this is all taking place within 6 seconds. Each game turn represents 6 seconds of time. Welcome to Flight Leader. This should conclude the tutorial of Project Aurora, and you should now have the basic concept to understand the basics of flight on the game board.